Good evening. My name is English Dawson. I'm a senior in the College of Agricultural Sciences, and I will be one of your hosts for this event. Thank you for joining us tonight for the second event in our two-event series, and welcome to African American Foodways, Sustainable Agriculture and Cuisine Across Cultures. I would like to ask everyone to think about what food sovereignty means to you. I welcome you to share your thoughts in the chat throughout the event. To do this, be sure to send your chat to all panelists and attendees. We hope that this event will evoke thought and action towards addressing food sovereignty and inequalities in our food systems while celebrating the many contributions of African Americans to our collective cuisine and agriculture practices. I'm now going to open up a poll so that you may get a better sense of who is here with you this evening. And while you guys are answering those questions, I'll share a little bit of a brief overview of this evening. We will start with a poem written and read by a representative of Penn State Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Studies organization. We will then show a pre-recorded video created and provided by Soulfire Farm. Following the video, Leah Penniman will join us for a facilitated Q&A session. You are welcome to submit your questions at any time during the event, and we will address them at the end. Please be sure to put these questions into the Q&A box and not the chat. Here you can choose to be anonymous if you wish. This event is also going to be recorded and will be available on the Student Farm YouTube channel until the end of December. So let's take a look at those poll questions now. And it looks like a majority of the audience today is a Penn State student and in the Pennsylvania area. So now that you have a better idea of who's with you tonight, I am honored to introduce Zoe Merriman, a wildlife and fisheries major with a dual minors in political science and politics and government. She is also the vice president of Penn State Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Studies, and an intern with the Sustainability Institute.
Hi, thank you so much for that. As mentioned, I'm Zoe Merriman, the VP of Manners, and I'm just gonna explain a little bit about our org. So Manners was brought to Penn State by Michigan State students in 1985, and has since then remained a member of a much larger national organization. From professional development activities and collaborations to regional and national conferences, we strive to establish an effective support system for minorities interested in pursuing careers in ag or related sciences. We've hosted graduate info sessions, participated in financial literacy seminars, worked with numerous guest speakers, collaborated with various other BIPOC organizations, and all things in between. So if you're interested in joining us, please refer to the information that will be provided at the end of this event. And speaking of our Manners community, our chapter engagement officer, Graziella, has prepared a brief poem to share with you all.
Hello, everyone. I'm Graziella Pilato. I'm a senior majoring in plant science with a focus in agroecology and a minor in Spanish. And I'm going to be sharing a poem with you all. I want to preface this with I'm not a poet, but I do love poetry, as well as I have just finished and am in the process of my graduate school applications to go into sustainable agriculture. So that's kind of where the foundation of this poem is. And it does not have a title at the moment. So, feel free to put recommendations in the chat afterwards. So here we go. Which part of me shall I sell? Because it feels as though my mind is not what is up for auction. You want me to summarize each part of myself, that which makes me whole. Not because you believe that my existence at the intersection makes me unique, but because my lack of stoplights has created a collision worth funding. This is an ode to application. This is a love letter to the deconstruction of self, outlined by their criteria. Dear highly esteemed faculty, Why won't you love me? What will it take for my voice to reach your mountaintop, to create a symphony within your forest? What must I say to devalue myself enough for you to value me? Quick question. Are these the only boxes, or do I get to be complex? Because I'm worried that you only want to wear me like a vest. You want my skin for leather so you can flout me about, strut through the halls because you've got all the clout. Maybe I'll say nothing. Keep my head down, stay small, remain as a flower on the wall. Do I have to pretend like I'm not the product of my circumstances? That I'm not the seed lying dormant, awaiting the perfect combination of heat and moisture to sprout into greatness? How has that, how is that analogy? Can you tell I know my stuff? That my dream is to return to the soil, take root in a landscape of farmers who look like me, love like me, care about the intersections, will act as crossing guards to deliver each piece of self to the other side. P.S. I've been told I look great in overalls. Am I beginning to look the part? What else is required to farm from the heart? Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that was an absolutely amazing and moving poem. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I'm so proud to see our Manners members shining. And now we're going to switch gears just a little bit to introduce an organization that I'm personally very excited to learn more about, Soulfire Farm. So located in Petersburg, New York, Soulfire Farm is an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm committed to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system. They work to bring diverse communities together and reclaim everyone's collective right to belong to the earth. Honestly, not enough could be said about this inspiring organization. So they prepared a video for us to watch that delves a bit deeper into their mission and to get all of you guys excited to hear from our two lovely speakers later on.
Wow, that was a wonderful video from Soulfire Farms, and I thank you, Leah, for sharing that with us. I'm Leela, and I'm Leela. I use pronouns she, her, hers, and we'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm a senior majoring in both animal science. I'm a senior majoring in animal science and also the president of Manners. For our first guest is Miss Leah Penniman, the founding co-executive director of Soulfire Farm and author of Farming While Black. As we saw in the video, our current disassociation from where our food originates and its history is both detrimental to the environment and the people who harvest it. The lack of connection and equal opportunity has led her for the past 20 years to begin healing this issue through outreach to communities in need, advocating for land justice, and creating anti-racist agendas supporting food sovereignty. Our second guest is from Penn State, an assistant professor in anthropology and African studies, and the one who will be hosting our Q&A tonight, Dr. Christina Douglas. Everyone, please welcome Leah and Christina.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and for witnessing the pre-recorded keynote. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
That was absolutely breathtaking in the scope and depth of what you shared and presented. I just want to say that as an archaeologist, I'm literally excavating the histories that you made so clear today in talking about the roots of our food system and our food crisis and the crisis that, as you put so eloquently, is tearing our communities apart and literally leaving people starving. So I just want to thank you and really take a moment to acknowledge the opportunity that you've given us to reflect, as you put it in your talk, on our ancestors and our own roots and our own history as part of this process. I guess the first question that I'd like to start with is to ask you for guidance for people who don't immediately know how to trace that ancestry, don't immediately know how to find and connect the dots to contextualize their own position in the system that we live in and in the community that we live in. Because I think that having that context in some ways is a first step to then being able to latch on and find ways to take action, you know, having that sort of understanding of our own sort of position in history.
That's such a good question. I feel like there's an academic, a social, and a spiritual answer to that. And so I guess from an academic perspective, I mean, there are means and mechanisms to search our ancestry. And I'm that nerd in our family who, you know, goes to the museums and the archives and does the DNA tests and tries to follow shreds and scraps of obituaries and birth records and piece it together. And that, for some people, that is a really important journey of healing, of recognition and acknowledgement of where we come from. And those resources are certainly available, and archivists are very helpful in that way, including at the National Museum for African American History. They have staff who will help you. But I think in absence of that, and I'll tell you a little anecdote, which is sometimes when we do an exercise in our uprooting racism training, we'll ask a series of yes/no questions for folks to start to grapple with these things. And one is, did your ancestors own enslaved Africans? And a lot of folks who present as white will do the I don't know, like the I don't know. And I think when we ask that question, not from an individual lineage, but from a social context, it's actually very important for all of us who hold various privileges to own and identify with the benefits that come with that privilege. So even if we can't say for sure that our ancestors materially participated in the slave trade or in slave owning, we know that the way that white supremacy works, and we know that the way that racial advantage works, is that all of us are really complicit in that system in some way when we carry those privileges. So that's the social answer. And then the spiritual answer is, I mean, for those who practice our indigenous religions or interested in our indigenous religions, we have ways of talking to our ancestors. So you can literally train yourself to be able to go and ask your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents about their lives and ask them for their guidance. And so there is a way, even when we don't have the paper trail, to be in touch with that lineage.
That's such a powerful answer, and I wasn't expecting you to bring in all of those different dimensions and kind of triangulate it. But I think it's important for us to dig a little bit deeper still into this question, because I'm sensing from members of the audience that there is this real need to understand our position, especially if we don't identify as a person of color, or if we don't identify as someone whose family, ancestors, and community have been on the receiving end of injustice, in order to then sort of reconcile and move forward and feel legitimate or legitimized in taking action and being a part of the movement. So I guess, what would you say to people who feel in some way, and you've started, but if I could dig a little deeper, who feel like they are not necessarily legitimized in joining, becoming an ally, becoming a part of this movement?
Well, I mean, my personal belief is that anybody who lives on land and anybody who eats food, needs to be part of the solution. And so it's, Black and brown folks didn't create a racially unjust food system, and we can't fix it by ourselves. And so we need every person with open heart and with a good mind to come forward and do their part. And so, my daughter Nishima, who is now grown, which is unbelievable, she says that the food system is everything it takes to get sunshine onto your plate, as I said. So there's so many points of intersection, and it's about finding that overlap between what our community needs and what are our leverage points and our desires and our passions. So yes, you know? And I think the thing is that sometimes trepidation comes around when we want to be in solidarity with people whose identities we don't share. And in those cases, it's just important to take the lead, you know, from impacted communities about what solidarity looks like. And we mess up, make mistakes, say we're sorry, try again. But to really make sure that if we're doing solidarity work, that we're taking the lead from the folks impacted by those issues.
Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your own journey, a little bit more sort of personally, in terms of learning not only about your own ancestors and your own sort of family and community's history, but really about this broader context and history that you shared with us during the presentation? I mean, it's, again, stunning in its breadth and also scope. And again, as an archaeologist who you know, goes back in time thousands of years to understand the roots really of the landscapes and communities that we live in today, I was amazed at the breadth that you so smoothly wove together in so succinctly wove together. But can you tell us a little bit about how you started to learn all of this history, because it is a very layered and complex one, and sort of where did you start? Where did you start kind of informing yourself? You mentioned that you spent time in Ghana studying, and so I would just love to hear a little bit more of that kind of timeline and how you did that.
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, those of us who consider ourselves nerds, I mean, that's just what we do, right? We try to investigate and research. None of this history was taught in any of the schools that I attended. As far as the kind of noble, dignified Black agrarian history, that started with a hypothesis 10 years ago that it might be possible that Black people contributed more to regenerative and sustainable ag than our labor under enslavement. I just put a hypothesis out and then tried to dig through the anthropology literature actually around some of these techniques and technologies that are often uplifted as ahistorical, or, you know, things like our no-till system, the raised bed, or everything that is under the umbrella of permaculture. And as soon as, you know, I started tugging on those threads in the literature, it became abundantly clear that we as global indigenous people originated all of these technologies, all of them. So that was really important. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, I've been very, very blessed to get to study in Ghana, West Africa, to study in Haiti, to study in Oaxaca and Mexico with the Afrodescendiente Comunidad, a community of Afro-descendants in Oaxaca and Veracruz. And so in the spirit of intercambio, or like exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge, between peasant farmers, doing what we can to, you know, uplift our traditions and our ways of being in relationship to the land.
Can I ask you a little bit about the effects of our food system here and the whole history that you shared with us, going back overseas? And you alluded to this in your talk, but I'm thinking even more specifically about effects back in, you know, Ghana or in Madagascar, which is where I work, of our sort of you know, extremely problematic relationship to agriculture, and kind of crossing the Atlantic once again. What are some of the things that are happening? I have one example in my head from Madagascar, but I
would love to hear your example, because I don't know much at all about Madagascar, and I can share as well, but would you be willing to tell us?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I was so struck because you brought up an example during your talk that is one that I often share in my African archaeology class. And I was so moved that you brought it up, because to me, it is a part of my own history and my family's history. And that is the need and intention to bring over skilled agriculturalists as laborers, you know, unpaid laborers in the Americas. And you raised the example of Senegalese rice farmers, right, who came over with that skilled knowledge, with the ability to grow these crops that would be drought resistant, drought tolerant, etc. So much knowledge that came over. Another group that is part of that rice cultivation group of specialists came from Madagascar. And I often talk to my African archaeology students about this example because in the Carolinas, there is a kind of hidden diaspora, or not hidden to themselves, but hidden to many people from Madagascar. And I think oftentimes people are surprised by that because they think of Madagascar as this sort of exotic place that they don't have a connection to. But actually, our desire to grow rice in the Carolinas connects us very, very closely to Madagascar. But the example that I was thinking of as you raised the rice example in your talk, of going back now across the Atlantic and creating these legacies of environmental injustice, legacies from the colonial period, is that in the colonial period on Madagascar, when the French were trying to subdue southern Malagasy farmers and pastoralists who had resisted colonial rule, they actually once again turned to a kind of agricultural or agro-pastoral sort of system and intentionally destroyed it. What they did in southern Madagascar was take a parasitic larva that they released amongst stands of prickly pear cactus that were essential to the livelihoods of Malagasy farmers and pastoralists, because this plant served as fodder for cattle during droughts. It also created a shallow underground sort of hydrology in a region that is prone to aridity and drought. And so by unleashing biological warfare, they wiped out this landscape that had been a resilient and sustainable one. And I think that there are other examples of that. And I think, one of the really important things for us to do as we educate ourselves, and I consider myself to be someone who's, really at the ground level in terms of understanding the implications of this history that we're talking about, is to keep going back and forth, because we're interconnected. What we do in our food system and what we sort of don't resist in our system in the United States has implications here, but it has implications broadly, around the world. So I was just thinking of that back and forth as you were talking.
Wow, that's really powerful. I want to educate myself more on that. You made me think of one example, and again, I'm not an international trade expert or policy expert at all, but in Haiti, which is my maternal homeland and a place where I've done a lot of work and study and learning and growth, this really insidious policy of the federal government under the USDA called Tied Aid, TIED, essentially says that when the US government is going to give food aid internationally, it needs to be grown by US farmers, packed in, by US corporations, shipped by US companies. And on the one hand, that sounds, fine and reasonable, but what happens in practice, and this was particularly poignant after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, was that the US dumped all of this surplus grain onto the market in the name of paternalistic aid, right at the time when the rice harvest was coming to market in Haiti. So, you can't compete with free rice. And so the result of this is making the farmers in Haiti unable to sell their rice, go out of business, and then increase the dependency on US imports. And this is all very, very intentional. At the same time, transnational corporations like Monsanto are benevolently donating GMO and hybrid seeds along with the fertilizers and pesticides that are needed to grow those seeds. And they'll make those donations just long enough to exhaust the seed caches of the Creole seed, like the indigenous seed, and then sell it. And then increase the dependency. And really, really powerful movement, the Haitian peasant movement, which is part of Via Campesina, they obviously see right through this and started blocking these shipments of the seed and chemicals at the port, setting fire to the donations, marching in the streets, all with their red, dress and straw hats, and then returning to do their sacred work of seed keeping. But it's very, very challenging, for a group of peasant farmers to stand up to the entire weight of the U.S. government and these transnational corporations. And so we've seen over time the percentage of food that Haiti is able to grow at home for itself, like, erode and decrease over the years. And with that, the autonomy, the sovereignty, the ability to decide our own destiny. So it's a really big issue. And yes, it's so interconnected, right? Because that grain surplus that we have here in the US and what we do with it can impact an entire food economy for our neighbors.
I mean, it's almost dizzying and certainly is overwhelming to think about the big system. And I guess one of the things that I'm going to take away from your talk tonight is that we can go back and forth between that big picture that you presented with such a complex and important history, and then in that moment where we feel kind of overwhelmed by it, and what can we possibly do in the midst of this sort of these larger forces, to come back to your very clear and strong message that is a very positive one about how we can act locally, how we can act. I mean, you quoted so many amazing activists and warriors in the fight for equality and justice, that it starts with feeding yourself and your family, and it starts with feeding your communities. And so we can then come back to that very local scale. There are several questions that are coming up in the chat about people who are interested in connecting with organizations in their region. Someone's asking about Canada and Ontario specifically, and whether you know of organizations there that they can link up with, but really to kind of be able to get connected to organizations or begin your own kind of program. I mean, while you were talking, I was like, man, how can I start something in central PA, where I am, in my backyard, in my home. And if you saw me this spring, I actually have a rotator cuff injury because I decided that I had to expand my growing in my backyard. And so I went overboard, and tried to build this farm myself, and made a ton of mistakes and went down all kinds of wrong paths. But as you were talking, I felt inspired again. And I felt this renewed sense that not only am I doing something that is a hobby, which, a lot of people think of having a vegetable garden in your backyard as sort of a wholesome hobby, which there's nothing wrong with that, but you really inspired us to think about it as part of this larger, amazing global movement, but that can have this very local root. So I guess to speak to those who are interested in doing this and in connecting to organizations, again, someone mentioned Canada, but people are curious if you have some advice for them.
So I don't know a lot about Canada. There's two really dope BIPOC-led organizations in Toronto. One is called Black Creek Community Farm, and the other is called Sundance Harvest. And we do on our website keep a list it's incomplete, but we're always updating it, of Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led land-based projects and farming projects, mostly US, but we throw in other regions when folks make us aware of that. So if you want to take a look at that list on our resource page, and if you want to add to it, also just shoot us an email, love@soulfirefarm.org, and we'll add to it, because I think that's really important to make sure that we're supporting our local Black, Indigenous, people of color led projects. And they're everywhere. They absolutely are. And one of the challenges is that, white led organizations, whether it's farms, businesses, nonprofits, have tended to get more shine and more resources, and so might have a stronger online presence or a stronger reach. So I ask folks to be patient and persistent, but figuring out who's in your area and how you can support them is a really good start. Every community has its own localized best practices and solutions, and so it's not like there's one umbrella answer that's going to make sense for every region.
And I just want to compliment you and say that, having looked at your website extensively myself, you all do an amazing job of not only spotlighting the wonderful work that you're doing, but really, uplifting and shining a light on other efforts. So it's a really phenomenal resource. And I'm glad that you're referring people to the website, because I learned so much and felt felt like I had hours and hours and hours worth of reading to do just based on your website. Somebody is asking in the chat, and I want to bring this up because it's linked to the organizations that you're supporting and what your thought process is about your work with the Justice for Black Farmers Act, and why the person is asking why this does not explicitly include Indigenous people. And because I'm not familiar with it, I'm going to let you respond to the question. And their follow-up is, how can we claim food sovereignty but not acknowledge Indigenous people as well within this act?
Absolutely. We can't claim food sovereignty and not acknowledge Indigenous people. So of course, I and we stand unequivocally with Indigenous rematriation and land back. So the Justice for Black Farmers Act was written by Senator Warren and Senator Booker, with input from hundreds of Black farmers across the country, and Soulfire Farm was asked for feedback on the bill. And we said, and I quote, we cannot replicate the harms of the Homestead Act, even as we struggle for the return of the millions of acres of land that were violently stolen from Black people, and that Indigenous rematriation and land back need to be centered. As I'm sure you're aware, the legislation has flaws, but it is not, I will say that I do not think that Black land return and Indigenous rematriation are at odds. As mentioned, depending on if you go by acres or land value, 95% to 98% of the arable land in the United States is white owned. And this bill is talking about 2% of the land, which is the amount that was stolen from Black people, being returned. And I think that there are lots of room for improvement in terms of the mechanism for right of first refusal. I think there's a lot of room for improvement around land trust and what those easements could look like. I also would really love to see the legislation introduced concurrently with an Indigenous rematriation bill, and to see Black Indigenous solidarity to support those efforts. I'm not in charge of that, but I do encourage people to reach out to Senator Warren and Senator Booker with your concerns. And there also is a webinar Q&A with some of the people who did write the bill that is coming up. It's on our Instagram if you want to see the webinar. So encourage folks to be in that conversation. But I really, really want to caution against the colonizer uses divide and distract tactics to try to make Indigenous and Black people feel like each other is the problem while they hoard all the land and the resources. So I encourage us to figure out how to work together to make sure that our community's right to land is honored.
So you've told us a lot about the history and the kind of present economic, political landscape. And you've encouraged us to find the ways in which we can become activists. Can you also give us some concrete guidance as far as educating ourselves about current policy? I mean, we've just been talking about it in your previous response, but where can somebody go who doesn't know what potential things are on the ballot, or things we might need to pressure our elected officials to do or to recognize? Where can we go to educate ourselves about these things as they relate to our food sovereignty?
That's such a good question. And I am really a baby in the policy world for sure. I'm a farmer, but I will say that the two places that I go when I want to learn about policy and what to advocate for would be the HEAL Food Alliance, which stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. And that's an umbrella organization that we are a member of, and there's many other member organizations, and they specifically work on policy. So things like the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, which would, equalize labor protections for people who grow our food and who do arguably that most important and sacred work. Another place that I go is the National Young Farmers Coalition, which has a policy branch, and they work, very actively on initiatives, especially to support beginning farmers. And we have been compiling a platform that you can also find on our website under Take Action, where, the things that we learn from our partners and our alumni and comrades in the network, we throw onto this platform document, which has a bunch of action steps, both in the policy sphere and also in the, private and community sphere.
So many resources and so much, of a push and help to get people involved and to get people educated. Somebody in the chat has remarked, as you did, that you weren't taught and they weren't taught the history that you shared in schools, in standard curricula. But they're also asking whether you know of efforts, educational efforts that are sort of mainstream, in which people are being taught a history that is an accurate reflection of what you have shared with us tonight.
Oh my goodness, I'm not aware, no, if there's a mainstream initiative to get this type of history into the curriculum. I know Ibram Kendi does some work around trying to push some anti-racist philosophy and strategy, and that's picked up a little bit of steam, but no. And I think it's really important because in some ways our public schools have acted like, maybe continue to act like, propaganda machines for racial capitalism. And so figuring out how to shift the curriculum to center and honor land and food and the beautiful multiplicitous and diverse history of this nation and those who contributed to it would be wonderful. And that shouldn't just happen in, special programs or private schools. That needs to be accessible to everyone.
Well, I'm going to admit to you that, today there was a call circulated at Penn State amongst faculty and came from the Sustainability Institute to encourage people, faculty, to develop new courses that in some way speak to issues with sustainability, justice, equality. And I was toying with the idea of trying to develop something, or rather redevelop my African archaeology class. And you have given me so much, literally so much food for thought tonight. Somebody else has asked actually what the quote is from your daughter about sunshine on a plate. And I want to ask you too, because I need to write it down before I forget, but you've given us that tonight and it's just been incredible.
So first I have to say, Nashima said this quote maybe when she was 7 or something, so that makes it cooler. But she said, I think the food system is everything it takes to get sunshine onto your plate. I was like, that's brilliant. From the sun to photosynthesis to our plants to all the labor, the capital, the ecology, the distribution, cooking, eating, that beautiful arc of eating sun.
You have to tell her that she has moved almost 100 people tonight with that quote at Penn State. It's just incredible.
I will tell her. She'll be very embarrassed. She's like, Mom, why are you always talking about me?
I want to ask you, Leah, kind of a final question that may, I say it's a final question, really it's opening up something that should be a whole other sort of session and discussion conversation. And that's about the impacts of the pandemic on the work that you're doing at Soulfire Farm, which is the way it was phrased in the chat from our audience member. But I want to expand it to talking about how this pandemic has both, and you alluded to it in your talk, has both exacerbated existing inequalities and injustices, but how it maybe has galvanized in other ways action. And I don't know necessarily that it has, but that's kind of what I want us to reflect on. Really, I want to hear your brilliance and reflect on this in the last couple of minutes that we have tonight.
I saw this, my kids showed me this hilarious meme of a dating app and the devil got matched with the year 2020. So it's been rough, y'all. Like, I mean, I'm laughing because otherwise I will, cry. But the attacks on our breath from all directions, like the choking of wildfire, the knees on the neck, the lungs filled with fluid, like all of this really fundamental disruption to life, to breath, has been unbearable, to say the least. And I couldn't be more proud of the team at Soulfire Farm this year. I mean, everybody just turned on a dime and pivoted to meet the immediate stated community need of, fresh food delivery to folks' doorsteps, building gardens, for people who needed to grow their own food, shifting things online, making sure that the bilingual, interpretation feature would work on Zoom so that our farm employees who speak Spanish in the region are able to access the emergency information. I mean, it was just really, really astounding. And And we're not unique in that. I saw that everywhere in our region. I mean, people almost within 48 hours having hotlines so that you could request groceries, and helping farmers get their online store going, and just starting to move food and move resources through these mutual aid networks. And my prayer is that we won't forget how to do that. Like, we won't forget how to take care of each other, how to really see one another, how to exist in these local spaces with local, not just being rhetoric, but actually being part of this web of mutuality. So that's my prayer. And I don't know. I mean, humanity honestly is kind of at this precipice where we have to figure out if the timeout that Mother Earth put us in, if we've really thought about what we did and we're ready to make a change, or if we're going to get out of our timeout and just go back to the ways, and see this as a passing fad. But I hope we learn. I studied biology in undergrad, so in evolution, there's a theory called punctuated equilibrium, where rather than having gradual change of species over time, you have this sort of stasis, and then you have a big cataclysmic event, and then a whole blossoming of change and explosion of biodiversity, and then you're at like a new stasis, but you never go back. And my prayer is that we're in this punctuated equilibrium where the cataclysmic event of 2020 with its multiple pandemics pushes us to another way of being. And that will be up to us to decide as humanity.
I have to pause and just think about that. Archaeologists take it from this long-term perspective, sometimes covering millennia, and looking at how communities, society, sometimes takes a leap in kind of a positive direction, and sometimes takes a leap in a direction that favors more inequality. And so it'll be for us to see and for us to be a part of. And I just want to thank you, because I think you struck the perfect balance and the needed balance between understanding a history, understanding the real seriousness of what is at stake, that life is at stake, that health is at stake, that our communities are at stake, but also giving us so many points of entry. I think you even said in your video, there are thousands of right answers and ways that you can take part and move forward. And I think that's a really powerful and needed message. I see one last person has asked in the chat if there are farmers in State College that they can that are doing similar work in this area that they can connect to. I'm just going to make a plug for myself. India Houston, if you are still out there in the audience, let's become friends, because I've been moved tonight and want to continue to do this work that Soulfire Farm and Leah and her amazing team are doing and leading by example. So thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and I have so much to think about. And I'm already excited about next spring. And although I know that there are things that I could be doing over the winter too. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all the student organizers who put this together. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah and Christina, for such a thought-provoking and energizing conversation. I'd like to take a moment to thank Leah Penniman, Soulfire Farm, Penn State Manors, and Christina Douglas for creating a wonderful shared space this evening. To the audience, I want to ask, has your definition of food sovereignty changed at all? How will you take action to address injustice in food systems? Each day, how will you promote and advance food sovereignty for all people? How will you celebrate the countless contributions that African American communities have made to our understanding of sustainable agriculture? We hope that each of you will seek to further your own learning and consider how you can celebrate and appreciate African American cultural traditions in your daily lives. So we have some additional resources for you. And there are a couple of slides, so please feel free to take screenshots. So I encourage screenshots. And so Farming While Black is Leah Penniman's book, and the scarcity plot is written by a colleague of Dr. Douglas's, and it will be available tomorrow to purchase. On this next slide, we have a bunch of courses that students can take. And there are, of course, many other resources available, and we will attach some of those to a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow. And when you get this email tomorrow, there will be a link for an online survey. We would greatly appreciate your participation in that. And if you're attending for a class, be sure to select your class in that survey. So one more time, I want to say that this video presented to you this evening was created and provided by Soulfire Farm. And here we have some contact information for Penn State Student Farm and Penn State Manors. And thank you again to everybody who joined today. I hope you all have a happy and healthy winter break.